Okay, of course, the usual clash is between human interests and the interests of other higher order species with some cognitive capacities and some capacities for pleasure and pain. Again, I want to talk a little bit about that in the animal welfare section before we wrap up this chapter and move to a case study. Reading from the book on page 351, halfway down, we find one immediate consequence of the above-mentioned approaches to environmental ethics is the consideration given to animals in each. Some, in line with biocentrism, proclaim that animals have rights or even demand animal liberation. This position would prevent using animals for food or clothing or for testing new drugs or other scientific research. They argue that animals have an intrinsic value similar or equal to that of the human person, and that using them for food, clothing, or science recognizes in them only an instrumental value. Okay, and then the book goes on to say that this is actually philosophically relatively weak. This is a frontline clash when it comes to business and the environment topics. And I want to just say a couple things using a simple visual metric as a way of conceiving of the different sides of this clash. Okay, so the classic stance in business ethics and in ethics more generally is to think of different living things as having value in accordance with a concentric circles model. So at the center of it, humans have value, special value. Okay, humans have rights. And a right is a really privileged kind of a thing. So to say that somebody has a right is to make a claim that has a corresponding obligation that others now have to fulfill. I have a right to live as an innocent human being. It means that you have an obligation not to kill me. All rights entail a corresponding obligation. And human beings, as bearers of rights, are deserving of special protections. And the consensus in Western law certainly expresses this. To do harm to a rights bearer merits a pretty substantial penalty. Okay, so the chief worthwhile thing then on classical moral theory is the rights bearer, and the human being constitutes that. Outside of that, you can also find other things that have value but not rights. By animals here, I just mean higher order animals, creatures with consciousness, creatures that can experience pleasure and pain, but not creatures that have cognitive capacities that are on our level. Okay, and we actually have expressed in the law, in Western law, the notion that animals have value. Okay, we have rules against torturing and mistreating animals. Okay, I'm reminded, I was thinking about this lecture today, and I was reminded of the case a couple years ago with Michael Vick, the pro quarterback, who got in trouble for torturing dogs as part of a dog fighting ring and spent time in prison as a result. Okay, you can't just do dastardly things to animals and expect to get away with it without any punishment. But certainly the punishment that is merited by doing dastardly things to animals is less than that is merited by doing dastardly things to rights bearers. Outside of those animals who have value, there are also living things which have worth, but they're not usually classified as having value or rights. And of course, this includes trees and plants and other kinds of living things. You can do things to those kinds of beings. You can chop off the limb of a tree and not face the sorts of consequences that you would face if you chopped off a human limb or if you chopped off a dog limb or something like that. Okay, and so generally, again, this is just the consensus view that I'm putting up here, and then I'll talk about the variations. The consensus view is that living things that don't have consciousness have worth, but crimes against them tend to be classified as property crimes and not as crimes against beings of rights-bearing capacity. Now, the fault lines of disagreement tend to be right here and right here. Okay, so generally speaking, this is a very big generalization, but there has been a progressive push to give animals greater status. A minority of Americans and Westerners would even say that animals are the bearers of rights. Okay, but this is certainly not a consensus view. It is a challenge view to say that animals are the bearers of rights who are on a par with humans. And of course, there are all sorts of issues that come with that. And it's pretty radical indeed, but sometimes you can find people who think that dolphins need representation in the legislature and gorillas should have habeas corpus rights and things like that, right to trial by jury and things like that. That's a bit extreme, but you can find that. Okay, and also you will find among certain, certain kinds of progressive views, the notion that living things who are seen as, in the classical view, less valuable than animals should be deserving of the same kinds of protections that animals have. So trees, for instance, can have crimes done against their person, as opposed to chopping off a limb and saying the tree doesn't feel it, so it doesn't know that anything's happening to it. Okay, now that's a general overview. The point of all this is just to provide some theoretical background to assessing issues of business and the environment. And we are going to go into a practical discussion now. Much of the rest of this chapter on business and the environment is stuff that is agreed upon by virtually everyone. So I'm not really going to spend much time on it. It's agreed upon, but like I mentioned at the outset in my opening lecture in this mini-module on business and the environment, although in theory everyone usually agrees that it's a good thing to preserve and protect the environment, in practice a whole bunch of companies and people cheat and don't do so. Okay, because it's almost always not in their immediate self-interest to do so. But in theory, everybody agrees it's a good idea to reduce atmospheric pollution. It's a good idea to reduce soil pollution. It's a good idea to reduce waste and to recycle. Again, you don't really find disagreement on these kinds of topics these days. I was reading in a business journal this morning about how the current administration, the Biden administration, is attempting to revive the Paris agreement on international carbon emissions and curbing those carbon emissions, which of course is a hot button issue these days. And the big issue, of course, right now is that there's consensus among the Western countries that their carbon emissions should be reduced, but the Chinese are refusing to reduce their carbon emissions almost like as such. And they make up now the majority of coal emissions in the world. And so what do you do when a gigantic country is refusing to cooperate? How can you have a worthwhile treaty that actually accomplishes things, etc.? The recent president, who was president, of course, until November, Donald Trump, was opposed to the Paris Agreement because he thought that it harmed American business. And it does harm American business. He's right about that. Because generally speaking, to curb carbon emissions is to do something that is more expensive and less efficient. And so you see there a big clash that's present at the very largest scale in business and the environment issues in our government right now. And the reason why China doesn't want to curb their emissions at all is because they think it will harm their business and harm their development. So that's going on these days. Let's take a look at a case study. And actually, let me throw it open for questions while I get set up technically here for the case study. Are there any questions or comments about any of the things we've just talked about in the chapter?